Hello again, and welcome to the weekly video summary for What is the Human? It's week 8. I'm Dr. Chris Lemming, and this week we looked at rivalry and violence. Again, we started with the idea this week of Homo imitans. Now, the idea that the human being is fundamentally an imitative creature. This goes back at least to Aristotle, who in the Poetics said the human is the most imitative creature in the world. And, recent science seems to have borne that out. Now, the implications of that have been theorised in a number of different ways. And we've looked at René Girard's work, mentioned Andrew Meltzoff's work and so on. Now, one of the things that our imitative behaviour allows us to do is to inhabit a society, inhabit a culture. What do I mean by that? Well, when we're born, we start to imitate those around us, so we learn how to speak the language that surrounds us. We even adopt the same accent, the same social behaviours, the same cultural behaviours, the same religious behaviours. And this goes on, so that we pick up cues about how to inhabit the society that we live in through imitation. One of the examples I gave in the lecture was how where to stand in an elevator when you walk into it, right? Generally people don't say, you need to stand and face the front. You just imitate, you just observe people around you. And this is the same of almost any social context, that if you haven't been, say, to a wedding before or a funeral before, you don't, you basically turn up and do what other people do, and that way that you fit into the circumstance. And this is really the way that imitation functions for the large part in society, as it helps to make us part of a particular culture. Now, this was the emphasis given to imitative behaviour by Gabriel Tarde, the 19th century French sociologist, who talked about imitative behaviour and human imitative behaviour in terms of social cohesion, in terms of the way that imitation brings about socialisation and humans inhabiting their culture. Now, that seems to be true. However, if it is true, there's a problem, because society is incredibly violent and filled with conflict. So if we are learning to fit in and so on, and we're very imitative creatures, then why is there so much conflict in the world? And there is a huge amount of conflict in the world, and potentially highly devastating conflict, at least since the 1980s, probably earlier. Humans now have the capacity to destroy the planet, virtually, if that's what they choose to do. So how do we then explain this? If imitative behaviour is primary in human beings, and imitation brings about a certain kind of social cohesion and allows us to inhabit a culture, why so much conflict? Well, in order to see this, you've got to think about the fact that imitation doesn't just prescribe certain social behaviour, but object-oriented desire. That is, it's not only the way we behave, but what we want, what we desire that is imitative. Now, what that allows us to do is to get in conflict with each other. Because if I imitate your behaviour with respect to accent, with respect to any of these things, like implicitly, you don't grow up deliberately imitating people's accents unless you're a very gifted child and you have fun doing those kind of things. But ultimately, you just pick up the things around you. Now, that's fine until I imitate your desire for something. And there's only one of those things to go around. So we can come into potential conflict with each other on the basis that our desires are as imitative as any other part of social life. Now, societies have been designed in large part to prevent those kinds of conflicts from happening. Class societies operate in such a way as to rigidly distinguish people so that they can't get into conflict with each other. Caste societies is another example of that. Now, I'm not saying that the argument is that these prevent violence, therefore they're fantastic societies. Obviously, the caste system is incredibly oppressive and violent, and the class system itself is the same. But what they are good at doing is preventing certain kinds of conflict. What would be the opposite of that? Well, Alexis de Tocqueville, a French aristocrat, essentially, travelled through the United States in the 1820s, 30s and 40s, and he made a number of observations about the American culture that he was seeing, and that these two things went together. One was this kind of notion of an equality between people. Now, again, I'm not talking about an actual equality here. I think I said this last week. It's not the Americans had slaves and so on, and they treated the indigenous people appallingly. But there was a almost spiritual or ideological or intellectual idea of equality between people. And that was borne out by democracy as well. Democracy is this idea of the rule by the many, where one vote is as good as any other vote. Now, what de Tocqueville says is this amazing: within these relations of equality between people, there's the incredible restiveness, the incredible kind of agitation. Now, why would that be? If you have equality between people, surely that should make them calm down. Well, what Tocqueville tends to indicate is that anyone who is my equal is also potentially my rival. And you can go back and listen to the lecture notes, because I talk about the way in which that implies a certain meritocracy, that if you're down, if you're poor in a society which has equality as an ideal, why are you poor? Well, because you're hopeless. Now, so these kinds of relations of equality can bring about certain forms of rivalry and certain forms of self-judgment. Now, in situations of mass rivalry between people, what happens is that equality between people gets even more and more exaggerated. So what you have is, between conflictual parties, increasing similarities, or what we call doubling of aggression. All forms of violence, most forms of violence which are reciprocal, demand a certain kind of symmetry, that antagonists increasingly look like each other. Now, once that happens, you can have the potential collapse of a cultural or social order. In one sense, that's all civil war is a collapse of a social or civil order within a country. So you no longer know who the official government is, you no longer know who the police are versus a militia, you no longer know who the president or the prime minister, or president usually, is, and so on. So all these cultural distinctions break down. Now, and they're also contagious, so conflict begets conflict. If this is true, then now we're presented with another problem, is how did humans even survive? So first we're like, how did conflict arise? Now it's like, well, if this is the case, then why didn't we all die hundreds of thousands of years ago? Well, one of the solutions to this problem has been proposed, again, by the French anthropologist, philosopher, René Girard. And what he says is that in situations of massive cultural disorder, what tends to occur is that a group or a person is identified. That person or group may have a small difference from the others. They may have a strange accent, they may be taller, they may be shorter, they may be very beautiful, they may be very ugly or something, anything that distinguishes them. And that people polarize around these people and blame them for the disorder. And essentially we call this scapegoating. So that some group is seen to bear the responsibility for the disorder begetting society, and people turn on them in a state of chaos. What happens is that those people are then expelled, or in most cases killed, and so on. And what that tends to do is bring the society back together. It's a horrible thing to think about in a way. Now, Girard doesn't say that this is natural, that we humans need to do it, just it's an empirical fact that we tend to do it. And what occurs as a result of that expulsion is people feel good about themselves. So you get rid of the scapegoat, who you don't see as a scapegoat, you see as really guilty, and then the social solidarity between you increases, and therefore what does that imply? Well, they really were guilty. It was great to have gotten rid of them. Now, that peace lasts until society starts to fragment again, and a new scapegoat is needed. Now, this is this is what Girard calls the surrogate victimage mechanism, and he sees this as really important in the history of human culture. Not only does it seem to cohere with a lot of human experience, and I'm talking about interpersonal experience of growing up or being at school or whatever, where people get picked on, where everyone turns on someone and creates a sense of community around that exclusion, but Girard's hypothesis here seems to explain a number of different things, anthropological phenomena that would otherwise we don't really know the explanation for, like the pervasiveness of sacrificial ritual, the pervasiveness of certain themes in mythology like twins and so on. Now, I can't go into that here. It's a very a long and detailed topic, and you can do some reading about that if you want. But I just want to finish off by talking about how this fits into other ways that we theorise human violence. Now, there have been traditionally two accounts of the cause of human violence. One, you might say, is the biological explanation. That is, human beings are essentially violent because of our biology, because of our evolution and history. That's going to include certain hormones, the fact that we have structures in place that allows us to have conflict with each other, and so on. Now, this seems to be true to a certain extent. Obviously, human beings are more violent than, say, sea slugs, and part of that must have to do with our biological makeup and our evolutionary history. So there's no doubt an element of truth to that. The other explanation has been what you might call an economic or economistic explanation, which is based around the idea of scarcity, is that people come into conflict because some people have stuff and other people don't have stuff, and that there's fight over resources. And again, that tends to, or that also seems to have an element of validity to it. Now, what the surrogate victimage explanation does, is it doesn't so much replace those other explanations, but fills them out in a certain way. For instance, if you assume that humans are violent because biologically we're just kind of predetermined to be violent, the question then remains is why some cultures end up being more, do some cultures end up being more violent than others, or at different times of history look more violent? Now, obviously, it's not because our biology has changed or their biology is so different from everybody else's. So those biological explanations can't explain differences, and sometimes massive differences in violence between different cultures. So we've got to be looking somewhere else for an explanation in addition to that. With respect to the second model, the economic explanation, again, this seems like a reasonable enough explanation. People do get into conflict over things. But the question remains is why we get into conflict over things, especially when it comes to things that have got nothing to do with our survival. So there are wars, for instance, over diamonds. Now, there's no reason why there should be wars over diamonds. We don't need them. So the question is, why do we get into that? What produces the scarcity? Because there's no natural scarcity of diamonds, or take your pick of any kind of luxury item that people get into conflict over. Well, the reason is that it's not so much, you can reverse the explanation, it's not so much that the scarcity produces the rivalry. You can say actually the rivalry produces the scarcity, right? There's no scarcity of diamonds until we get into a rivalry over them. That's going to produce the scarcity. So again, what the surrogate victimage explanation tends to add to this is it doesn't supplant the biological, or in some cases socio-biological explanation, nor does it supplant the economic explanation, which is common actually both to leftist and rightist explanations of violence, but it puts both into a different perspective. And that also allows us to explain some of the signal differences that exist between human violence and non-human violence. But we really have run out of time at this point. We're going to have to go back to the lecture and then some of the readings to have a look at what those differences are. Anyway, I understand there's a huge amount of material in today's video summary, and it may, if you didn't go to the lecture and you haven't done the reading, this video summary may not make much sense to you. So I'd encourage you to go back and have a look and have a listen if you can, and see whether this makes a little more sense. Anyway, that's enough for now. Thanks.